Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Mohan, for those words. What we'll do now is I will just briefly show a couple of slides to give a bit of a background to the issue and how we're going to frame to this discussion, and then we will have the speakers speaking. So, yes, this is a very, very brief background as to what Dr. Mohan alluded to in his opening remarks earlier. In May 2010, TI Malaysia published the book Reforming Political Financing, in Malaysia. Now that book, if you have not had a chance to read it, has got lots of well-founded research, interviews, quotes, and recommendations, which were subsequently brought forward to the governments of the day. The first major event that happened after that is that in August 2015, the National Consultative Council on Political Financing was formed by the Barisan National Government. That committee produced a report and submitted it to the government of the day in October 2016. So that committee, which was chaired by Dato' Paul Lau, who was the president of TI when the book was launched, and he was then subsequently the minister in the Prime Minister's Department, used the framework of the recommendations from the TI book as the basis for those discussions. But the final result and the final report took into account the views of many stakeholders. Now, after 2016, there was a very vigorous engagement process with all political parties. This was undertaken by both civil society and also the government to get the feedback and expectations of political parties to this issue. Subsequently, in March 2018, we noted that the Pakatan Harapan coalition at that time had put in their manifesto, promise number 18, which was to create a political financing mechanism that has integrity. So this was very good points that we were seeing coming from both sides of the political divide. Yes, and subsequently, after they came to power in January 2019, the National Anti-Corruption Plan, which is a very comprehensive plan to address corruption in the country, included this topic as the top strategic priority. It was the #1 strategic priority of the 22 that was identified in the document. The timeline during that launch in January 2019 for reforming political financing was implementation between January 2019 to December 2020. Okay. Now, subsequent to that, there were many announcements by the government of that day with regards to the progress and the readiness to bring this issue to Parliament via legislation. In October 2019, the government announced that the bill would be tabled in Parliament in 2020. And the understanding was that a draft legislation had been prepared for discussion by the Parliamentary Select Committee. So that was the last that we heard about it in October 2019. And subsequent to that, with the changes that have happened in government, the latest notes that we can see with regards to the status of this topic is that the NECP's midterm report, which was published in May this year, 2021, by GIACC, the unit within the Prime Minister's Office that oversees the implementation of the NECP, had revised the timeline for political financing to January 2021 to December 2022. So it had essentially still remains within the NECP, but in terms of its implementation, it has been pushed back literally by 2 years from the original. So that's where we stand right now. As I've stated, the draft legislation was prepared previously. So we don't know the status as to what is going to happen next with regards to the government. There may be more discussions, there may be more reviews. So we wouldn't want to speculate what it's going to be. The fact remains that it still remains as part of the NACP. And I think our challenge is to find out how soon it can be brought forward to the next stage, which is at the very least discussion in Parliament within the Parliamentary Select Committee in vetting new bills. So that's where we stand right now with regards to this issue. For today, what we plan to do is focus our discussion points on these 5 key areas. Now, these key areas were taken from the 22 recommendations of the Transparency International book that I alluded to earlier, published in 2010, 11 years ago. So to frame today's discussion, we're going to talk about the independence and the enhancing independence and regulatory functions of the Election Commission, which is crucial, right? Whenever we talk about reforming political financing, we'll try to talk a bit about this regulating sources of funding, whether they come from local foreign donors and whether there should be limits on the donations, and disclosure, which is very key. Who is donating, right? Prohibiting using of slush funds and using government mechanisms for political parties, mandatory governance mechanisms for political parties, enhancing accountability for campaign expenditure, going down the path of perhaps having independent audits of political parties, right? And finally, creating a level playing field for all political parties so that it does not seem as though the incumbent has an unfair advantage over the newer players, right? So based on these discussion points, we will now invite our speakers, our panelists to give their views on this issue. Panelists can discuss their reasonings for supporting, not supporting, or proposing modifications to the recommendations made. And then we will, after hearing from them, we will have the group discussion and hopefully also incorporate some of the comments that are from our viewers. So I would like to firstly introduce Thomas Fan of Bersih 2.0 to share with us his views on this topic. Thomas?
Thank you very much, Moderator Helen. And also a very good morning to everyone, President Mohan, fellow panelists, and also viewers on Facebook and also within this Zoom room. Let me just quickly share screen with you. Okay. So, we had a discussion before this between Professor Gomez and myself that we'll be focusing on the 5 key points that Helen mentioned just now. And how we would divide our presentation is that Terence will focus on the source, the income of political financing, whereas I will focus on the expenditure side of it. So with that, I will be talking about point number 1, enhance the independence and regulatory functions of the Election Commission. And number 4, enhance accountability for campaign expenditure. And also number 5, public financing or public funding of political parties to level the playing field. That is an income. But because Bersih, we recently commissioned a paper written by Ideas on this very topic. And I would want to share some of our recommendation on that. I'm also aware that yesterday, Tricia Yeo, the CEO of Ideas, also presented something on public funding. But I think this is such an important consideration that I would be making a presentation on it as well. So on enhance of independence of and regulatory functions of the Election Commission, I think the independence of any election commission or election management body is absolutely critical for the formation of government, because this is the one body that conduct the contest to decide who has the right to form government for the next 5 years. And it has to be a body that is absolutely independent, not only seen to be so, but also in actuality, in function, is independent, because without an independent body that conducts the election, the legitimacy of any elected government would always be in question or in doubt, you know. And when there is doubt, there is question, then you're going to have political instability and even citizens who are not willing to support policies promoted by the government. So I think as Bruce, we have always pushed for a level playing field and also for the independence of the EC. We are really on the side of the EC, though many think that we are the enemy or nemesis of EC. Actually, no, we are actually the best friend of EC, because we want the EC to be a truly independent body. So when you talk about independence, there's a few areas that we have to look at. First of all is the way the election commissioners are appointed. Right now, the Prime Minister has a sole discretion to appoint people that he thinks fits the bill to serve in the election commission, and then he makes the recommendation to the Yang di-Pertuan Agong to be appointed. And I think that is something that always leave a question mark, whether these are people that are appointed because they are subservient to the Prime Minister and the government of the day. And I think we always question the independence of the EC on that basis, that a lot of the decisions made seems to favor the government of the day. And that is not something that I think is acceptable to any Malaysian. So the appointment process, to us, it has to be taken out of the hand of the Prime Minister. And very quickly, what we see is that there should be a nomination committee consisting of independent people who would call for nomination from the public. Because to be an EC commissioner, you don't need to be someone that is from that particular body or that particular service. It can be someone, a former judge, a lawyer, or anybody from civil society. So a nomination committee will receive names, shortlist them, interview them, and then give a shortlist to a parliamentary special select committee that would further scrutinize the shortlisted name and then give to the Prime Minister the one name where he will then recommend that person to the King. So in this way, I think we can ensure that this whoever appointed the 7 commissioners, they are not people who are aligned to the government of the day or even to any political party. So that is our quick recommendation. But also on budget, right now the EC is considered as almost a part of the Prime Minister's department, and the budget comes from the Prime Minister's department. I think this is something that, again, when you hold the purse string, you have a lot of influence over how decisions are made in election matters, and also the staffing. Staff from the EC secretary downward are all taken from the public service department, which means they are government servants that are rotated and seconded to this. The problem with that is the EC commissioners do not have a free hand to appoint people who are committed to free and fair election. They are dependent on the Public Service Commission, the chief secretary, for their staffing. I think this is something that can be separated so that they can achieve fuller independence. But also, one of the frequent complaints about the EC is it's like a toothless tiger, especially when it comes to elections. And when it's obvious to many and to ourselves, there have been violations of the Election Offences Act. We do not see the EC able to actually take strict action. But under current law, the EC have to make police report to wait for the police to do their investigation. And if they do their investigation, then submit the report to the Attorney General chambers for action. And As a result, very few action are taken on electoral offences over the years, very few. And therefore, there is a sense of impunity when it comes to obeying, the law for election offences. And I always say, it is quite ironical. Here we are having an election to elect lawmakers, but they started out as lawbreakers, by not respecting the Election Offences Act. So we recommend that the EC be empowered to at least give compound fines. Even traffic police have the power to give you a compound fine if you're not wearing your seatbelt or you're on the phone while driving, things like that. And you're not happy, you can go to appeal to the court. And I think the EC don't even have that kind of power. So at the very least, the law need to be amended to allow EC for that. But more deeper reform for EC is actually about the dividing the functions of EC. And there are 6 different functions of ECs that are done by currently just one body, the Election Commission. But in our paper that we published a few months ago, we recommend that the EC be split into three election management body. And first one, the EC will continue to conduct election, and we also recommend that the EC be the one that register and regulate political parties. So the EC conduct the election. And then we have another body called the EEC, Election Enforcement Commission, to adjudicate disputes, because there will be disputes among the parties, among the candidates over election matter, and even dispute over the way EC conduct the election, whether they were fair or not. Who do you go to? You go back to the EC. So there is a possibility of conflict of interest. So our recommendation is that there is another body, commission, that actually adjudicate all this and resolve disputes on electoral issues. Okay. Of course, another option is to go to court, and there are already processes there as well. And lastly, every 8 years or more, there is a requirement to delimitate or delineate election boundaries fairly. And that has always been one of the big issues when it comes to free and fair election in Malaysia. It may be fairly free, but certainly it is not fair from the point of view of delineation. Because here we have YB Ong Kian Meng, the representative for Bangi, and it is by far the largest constituency in Malaysia. If I'm not mistaken, right now it's about 200,000 voters, compared to the smallest parliamentary constituency, Igan in Sarawak, with about 20,000 or so. So that is 10 times the difference between constituency. But even within the state of Selangor, you have the problem of Sabah Bernam with 40,000 and Bangi almost 200,000 right now. Okay, so this is what we are proposing for reform to the EC. The other area that we want to look at is enhance the accountability.
Thomas, if you could wrap up very quickly, I'll give another 2 minutes or so. Because if you could try.
Well, I did ask for a bit more time earlier. Yeah. You were not around.
Try to, yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Is enhance accountability for campaign expenditure. So that would require amendment to the Election Offences Act 1954. The spending limit, I think, need to be adjusted because of inflation. Increase from 200 to 400 for parliamentary seat, and for state 600 to 200. This is just our recommendation. But with increase in limits, we also expect increase in transparency and accountability. Therefore, we recommend that the returns by candidates be audited by accredited auditors, not by the EC themselves. All right. So just like any accounts that you submit yearly, and that all the Form B, the returns, be published on the website of EC or public scrutiny. Then on public financing of political party, that is using taxpayers' money to fund political parties. This is more common than we realize. At least 2/3 of countries around the world have something like this. And the reason for we proposing public funding of political parties are to curb spending raised in election. Election can be very expensive. If there is no curb, no limits on it, then it can become like American elections where hundreds of millions of US dollars are spent by each candidate just to win an election or lose an election. But also to reduce the influence of private funds, promote a more level playing field, and also help the parties take their focus away from fundraising constantly to performing their duties, and also moderating partisan appeals. What we mean by that is that if political parties need to have funds, get their funds from the public or from public sources, then they will have to moderate their position. The extremists among them probably will not get much funding because their vote share will be less, and also their public support will be less, but they may win a few seats, right? So it will moderate their extremism, but also it promotes more stable and institutionalized parties and party system, more transparency and accountability because you're receiving public funding, and also an opportunity to give incentive to promote gender or even youth representation in politics. In other words, party with more women being elected get a bit more money. So these are the important reform, and I will just skip on this. So our recommendation is public funding, vote-based direct public funding for regular party and campaign expenses. In other words, if your party won 20% of votes, then you get 20% of the funding, all right? And seat-based, so part of the funding will go to the number of seats you actually win. Because in our first past the post system, currently, winning votes doesn't translate to seat. You can win 49% or even 50% of seat, but of votes, popular vote, but you get only 30%. So this would kind of balance that out. And also, I mentioned indirect. Also, another important is indirect public funding through subsidies or for broadcast for all candidates and parties, printing, postage, and free usage of public and government building at certain times. These are indirect way that we can assist political party to overcome their need for finance. Because if you don't provide public finance to political party, they will have to find their funding from elsewhere. And oftentimes it will be illegal, or it will be beholden to whoever is giving the money. So that is why public funding should be considered. So with that, I just want to thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. I appreciate this. There's so much to be covered, and thank you so much for doing it very, very clearly. Thomas spoke about the fact that he will focus on expenditure, and he highlighted a few points which are very, very salient. Talked about splitting the EC into 3 bodies to make it functionally more effective. And I think one of the topics that has always been that comes up during this discussion on reforming political financing is how we are still using laws that were framed in 1954 in terms of limiting expenditure, 100,000 ringgit for state seats and 200,000 for parliamentary seats. Something that was framed in 1954 is still the law, right now, and how it's so urgent that we relook that. And his recommendations with regards to vote-based direct public funding, seat-based and indirect, to make it a more level playing field, especially for parties, that should be rewarded for the popular votes that they get, so to speak, and to address the first past the post system that we have. So thank you very much, Thomas. I'll now like to invite Dr. Terence to share his slides. Dr. Terence, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you put up the slides, please? Yes. Let me start by thanking Transparency International for inviting me to speak. I also want to thank the 3 politicians who have joined us here today It's always been able to get politicians to join us for a discussion when we discuss topic of money politics. I'd like to particularly acknowledge YB Hongming, who has been engaged in a discussion with going back many years. In fact, we started this in 2008, that epochal election in 2000, when the opposition managed to get control of 5 state governments, and they also developed a huge presence in parliament, secured a huge presence in parliament. But unfortunately, in spite till today, 13 years, and in spite of the massive campaign on the reform financing of politics, we have achieved. So this is why today's debate is important. You will see here, I have put up a slide with the title, Do It Right. As Alan said, we started out with a book on this, then had a report on this about 10 years later. Today, we've come up with a new mechanism on how to fix political finance. We're using a comic form, cartoons. We're trying to simplify a complex issue in a way in which we can then educate the public on why this is so important. So this comic was done by this NGO called New Narrative. Oh, please do read it, and I invite the politicians also to distribute this to ours in the public arena. Let me now can we go on to the, I'll now go on to the next. Let me start. I was asked to speak on where is the money coming from. Okay, today, I'm new to this. Oh, yeah. Can we have the next slide? Okay, here, let me start with today. Let me start by the obvious. Today, what we have is a problem with regards to MPs for sale, politicians hopping. We've also had this other problem, parties themselves, parties as a whole, hopping in search of power. The problem with this is that today, this has raised serious allegations about when politicians hop, they are being bought over. These are allegations. But this is why, and this is seriously undermining the confidence we Malaysians have in our politicians. And this party hopping is becoming quite rampant, contributing to great instability. The question, where is this money coming from? This brings me now to the issue of another issue that we've been discussing at length for many years, the issue of GLC reforms at the federal level and the state level. We know that this is what I call a shadow, a world we know that exists, but it is in shadow and we know so little about it. One MDB was exposed, immediately brought to attention. One MDB, a GLC, foreign funding, secret party war chest, individual war chest, all came out. But we saw very little in terms of a discussion about GLCs. There was a lot of discussions on corruption. There was no real discussion on reform of the GLCs in spite of all this being exposed. In 2020, when the pandemic broke, it was clearly exposed by then Finance Minister, current Finance Minister, Tunku Zafrul, that we need to use this GLCs effectively. And they did it. They used the GLCs for in a number of ways to help the bank moratoriums, Tenaga cutting the rates on electricity supply. But after doing that, we also saw how GLCs used by then Prime Minister Muhyiddin to consolidate by giving appointments to politicians to ensure that he remains as Prime Minister. Again, the views of the GLCs. At state level, what's happening at the state level? Also talked about this in terms of the creation of MBI, 3% Incorporated, or in some states like in Penang, they call Chief Minister Incorporated. Chief Minister Incorporated and Menteri Besar Incorporated indicates that in every state, there are these institutions called MBI. And most recently, the current Chief Minister of Kedah, alleged previous Chief Minister, Mukris is here today. I'm sure he'll want to talk on this, alleging that about 13 million ringgit was transferred abroad to Canada. Meanwhile, in Selangor, the Kuala Langat forest controversy, and MBI was mentioned. So what we're seeing here is that GLCs are also the allegations of serious abuse of funds involving GLCs, MBI, or CMI at the level. This is a widespread problem, indicating that there is a shadow world which dark money is coming from. More recently, we have had the court case after Pakatan took over. Finally, those who were involved in corruption were brought to court, and the court cases are going on. But what is interesting is, if you read the court cases very carefully, you will find that they now drawn attention to the use of foundations. Another shadow world has now emerged, something we did not know anything about. Foundations. And if you look at all these court cases, when they talk about the foundations, they talk about how money is coming from the private sector, channel into these foundations, control politicians, another shadow world with a lot of money. Money used for their personal interests and also used for political party campaigns. Now, in C4, we wrote a report called Foundations and Donations, Political Financing, Corruption, and the Pursuit of Power. It was just published earlier this year. I'm raising this point because the report clearly indicates that there is this use of foundations by politicians where they are not being accountable to members of the public. And here, if you look at the court cases, in trying to deal with this expose, what do they say? These were political donations. This comes back to the point that Thomas was raising. Political donations for whom? And how are they being abused or used? Why is there no law on this? What is interesting is, in spite of this expose on foundations and the way in which political donations have been abused, contributing to serious corruption, no politician has spoken about the need for reform of political financing to check with this issue. Now, few politicians are sitting here with us. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I have not seen any suggesting that we should do something about these foundations. And let me tell you that there are foundations at many levels, at the federal level, in the ministries, at the state government. GLICs like PNB and Khazanah have foundations. The GLCs like Sinar Darby have foundations. Private firms have foundations. Prominent businessmen have foundations. Prominent families have foundations. And all of them are contributing, it appears, money to the political system. This is why we need to have reforms. Now, I also want to talk about parties. We have talked about instability at the federal level in governments, but what about parties, factional feuds? The feuds are fueled by money politics. We know that. We know that the feuds are also leading to hopping in the pursuit of power, in the pursuit of getting plum appointments in government. The volume of money is increasing. When we talk about hopping and this feuding and this party elections, also the money that's involved is huge. Across the board, many parties, PKR also had real problems in the election about money politics during the elections. Where is all the money coming from? That is the question that we have been asking, and we have not been getting any answer to that question. The second point we really need to get into is we are dealing with a pandemic, this serious health crisis. As I mentioned earlier, Afrul admitted that we have a government ecosystem. The GLCs can be used to save the economy, but are they being used to do that? Instead, we saw the move away to power, consolidation of power. And then we saw how particular parties wanted to get control of particular GLC statutory bodies. SPARS was very interested in getting control of the statutory bodies because they have roots deep into the military. I'm more interested in getting control of cash-rich GLCs, publicly listed GLCs. What an abuse of a system that we need to have today to deal with the pandemic. I am glad that now that a MOU was signed, an MOU on transformation and recovery was signed, I'm glad to see that this thing was done because they dealt with important points. The points that they dealt with, which I feel we need to draw attention to, I'm particularly pleased with, is with parliamentary reforms. We are having a dysfunctional parliament. We know that. And the reforms focus a lot of attention on that. And they also talked about the MA63, talked about judicial independence. Fine. But I draw attention now to issues they did not discuss. I have dealt at length with the issue of the GLC, political business nexus contributing to corruption, patronage, and appointment of directors. Know this. Why was there no discussion about these reforms? Why is there no discussion of setting up a parliamentary select committee to deal with this problem now? Because this does impair free and fair elections. Why is there no discussion on political financing? I'm sure the politicians will give us the answers, but I want to put it there so that they can deal with these issues, because these are questions we are asking. We know, as we have seen, political financing can shape the conduct of elections. But political parties seem reluctant to discuss this, to introduce this. I will be more partial to the Pakatan people because, as Alan said, they were planning to introduce this before the government fell. I'm sure they'll say this. But I still want to raise the question, what was taking so long? 2 years into power and they still had not even tabled it even. And I will not bother to discuss it in commission because the point has been raised and at length by Alan. But I want to go to the point. Why do we need these reforms? Now, the reasons here. The level of monetization of politics in this country has escalated appreciably, particularly so after the epochal election in 2018. It's completely out of hand. What is also important is look at the excess funding. I'm glad the point was raised yesterday about the new young generation and how they have an impact on this. And I'm talking about the new young generation within parties too. It's the older parties and older politicians that seem to have the capacity to keep themselves in power. The problem of warlords, old warlords remaining in power. We have in power today politicians been around since the 1980s and refusing to go. This undermines elections within parties. I raised the point of dark money coming from a shadow, covert forms of funding. I mentioned nations, the new phenomenon that has just been exposed in the court. The GLCs remain a concern. Alan just made the point about legislation. We have legislation that was created before independence that remain in place. Why is no political will to deal with this legislation? Now, when Alan spoke about the campaign that was done first in TI in 2010, we focused on two things: legislative reform and institutional reforms. The Paul Low Committee really dealt with legislative reforms. I must tell you, there was also another campaign led by G25 comprising 70 NGOs where we said legislative reforms are not enough. You must have institutional reform. That means while you have a legislation in place, you also have an independent institution monitoring the laws so that there's no selective persecution of particular parties, particularly opposition-based parties. I'm saying this because opposition-based parties tend to be undermined by the party in power when it returns sources of funding. They go after the funding sources. Another institution which I want to point out, which Alan has not dealt with, is the Register of Societies. How can the Register of Societies, which is under the control of a minister, be in charge of deciding which parties get registered or deregistered? It just doesn't make any sense. The whole system is, for want of a better word, completely nonsensical. And yet there has been no change of the system too. And what about money-based factionalism? We have to stop this money-based factionalism. This money-based factionalism starts within the party and is now permeated in the mainstream and is now part and parcel of state and federal elections. As I said, the situation is getting out of hand. Now, I'll end very quick because I've said my piece on the problems as to sources of funding. I cannot give the details on the source of funding because it's a shadow world. Unless we bring this into the light, and unless politicians are willing to talk about the MBIs, the CMIs, they function, as well as those at the federal level, Minister of Finance Incorporated, and the GLICs and LCs and statutory bodies, we are never going to have the full picture. They have to stop keeping the GLC world in the shadows if they are to be truly accountable to us. So here are the three main recommendations which came out won't get into. You can see it here for yourself. The Political Financing Act has to come up. I'm keen to know what is in the Post-Political Financing Act that was supposed to be tabled, that they conform with these points that we are saying. An independent election commission, and also the point equitable financing. The point was made about public funding. I want to end on one point, and I've had major discussions with politicians, including Ken Ming. Ken Ming is here, he will attest to this. I have said, while we talk about party financing, it's not just for federal and state elections. We also have to enforce in the law some kind of monitoring how money is used during party elections. Of course, parties won't like it. They may say it infringes on their privacy, fine. But let's get to the root of the problem. Money politics started within parties during elections. This goes back to the 1980s. Team A, Team B, and before that, Razali versus Musa. That's when it all did during Mahathir's administration in 1981, 1983, 1987 elections. And then it has just escalated. And when factions have moved out from UMNO and created their own parties, they brought with them their money politics, using money during elections too. It's now widespread, as I said. So while the objections to this, if we really want to deal with this, we also have to look at this issue of how party elections are being conducted. And let me end you by repeating a point I said earlier. Young candidates in some parties are finding it very difficult to run and secure posts because they just don't have any to practice patronage and to distribute to party members on the ground to win elections. So let me end here. I have a few more slides, but I'm not going to get into it because I feel these are issues that Thomas has already spoken about, but I will let you all have the slides so that we have a further discussion on this. But I'd like to end on this note. I am making an appeal to the politicians. You have to come clean with sources of funding. And if you do not come clean with your sources of funding, and if you do not help us push through legislation on political financing, then the crisis that we have confronted with in the country today is just to persist. It is time that we clean up the financing of politics. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Terence. Yes, so Terence touched a lot about the abuse of GLCs, how it could be used to consolidate power. Foundations, which is something that we're seeing in the court process right now, how foundations can be used, controlled by politicians, and funded by the private sector. Terence correctly identified the focus should also be on institutional reforms and not only legislative. And his final plea to politicians is essentially what civil society has been asking for the longest time, which is for politicians to act to address this issue in the fastest possible way. Okay, so based on that, thank you, Terence, for your input. I will now invite Dr. Ong Kiong Ming, who is the MP for Bangi. Dr. Ong was served as the Deputy Minister of MITI under the PH administration from July 2018 to February 2020. He was formerly the MP of Serdang and is the current Member of Parliament of Bangi. He was also the Assistant National Director for Political Education for DAP. Dr. Ong, we'd like to hear from you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Thanks, Dr. Mohammed. Thanks, Transparency International, for inviting me to this important forum and important topic. I think Terence has brought up a couple of issues that I'd like to address off the bat, since I think those are issues which need sort of like a fresh response, especially since these responses may not have been heard before in any of your previous seminars. And I'd like to address it in turn, in terms of, firstly, Terence saying that we have achieved nothing in terms of political and maybe constituency financing and funding since 2008. I think that's factually wrong, because even though we've not gotten to the stage where we would like, there has been quite a number of efforts that has been done since 2008. For example, constituency allocation for the opposition started actually in the PH controlled states in Penang and Selangor. Of course, I personally would like to see these constituency allocations go up to equal for both opposition and government in places like Selangor and Penang. But I'm glad to see that this has already taken place in a place like Perak because of the agreement that was signed by the UMNO Menteri Besar, as well as Pakatan Harapan, led by, I think many of the negotiations were led by the DAP in that state on behalf of PH, with consensus from PH, of course. And then we have effectively more or less equal allocation at the state level in Johor, right? Again, led by UMNO MB. So I think now with the signing of the MOU, which as far as we know, in the MOU itself, it's equal constituency financing for all MPs who have whose parties have signed up for the MOU. Hopefully, I think this gets extended to other opposition MPs as well, whose parties may not have signed up, including Dato Sri Mukris's party. And I think this is actually a very big step in terms of moving towards maturity in the political system. Although it doesn't deal with political financing directly, but the fact that equal allocations are given to MPs and political reps on both sides means that there will be less pressure, for fundraising on the part of opposition MPs, especially, but also on part of government MPs for some of their constituency work. This does not, of course, address the question of political financing for party-related activities, including, for example, party elections that Terence has talked about, that I will address shortly. On the issue of foundations, yes, I think these personal foundations as well as government foundations, is something that is of concern. I'll also add, it's not just foundations, but also companies limited by guarantee by the various ministries. Obviously, we know MOF, that's, they own or control the most, agencies or institutions this way. But there are also other, these kinds of creatures that are out there. For example, something called Education Malaysia. I'm not sure whether people here are familiar with it, but it basically processes all the visas of foreign students coming to Malaysia, and it does, promotions for, especially for the private sector, overseas. And this EMGS, Education Malaysia, is completely owned by the Ministry of Higher Education now, and definitely could be a source of patronage. No MPs having spoken up against some of these foundations. I think my colleague Hannah Yeo would disagree. I think she's talked about some of the abuses that have happened within the Wilayah Persekutuan Foundation, or the Yayasan Wilayah Persekutuan, which of course is the co-developer of Rimba Kiara, one issue that she has championed for even before she became an MP. On the issue of political financing, the MOU, I think there were many issues that we wanted to put in the MOU, including, for example, constituency delimitation. I have a personal interest in this. As Thomas has said, my constituency is the biggest in Malaysia. Not quite 200,000 voters yet, but I think getting there. The last statistic that I got from June 2020 was about 192,000. But yeah, I think with the implementation of Undi 18, I'll get to over 200,000 very, very quickly. But yeah, because of the need to focus on certain things more than others in the MOU, we decided not to put in political financing or delimitation of constituencies in this MOU. But I think the spirit of the MOU may allow these kinds of discussions to be had later on. And then on the final issue of party elections financing, I think Terence brings up a very good point here, and I perhaps want to share something based on my own personal experience. I can't speak for political financing and political and party elections in UMNO, but I've heard that it can be very expensive affairs. Thankfully, this is not the case in DAP, not yet. We are going to have our party CEC elections soon, I hope. It's been postponed because of the pandemic, and also for my own state of Selangor. I've not had to spend, as far as I know, any money. Maybe for one dinner or two together with some of my colleagues, but the amount is actually very, very small. And this is, probably left over from my the funds that I raised from the 2018 campaign. So most of us are pretty frugal at the DAP, and we don't have that kind of practice of trying to buy off delegates, right? But to Terrence's point, I think this is something that is of concern moving forward. Because I think there will be increasing pressure on politicians, especially younger politicians, to perhaps use their constituency allocation from the state or from the federal governments to give political contributions to party members through NGOs that they control, through associations that they control. And this is something that I hope we can have a more substantive discussion on, even within my own party. For those who are listening in on the media, this is definitely something that you may want to highlight because it's something that perhaps has not been discussed that much within my own party because of the sensitivities leading up to the next CEC elections. Okay, with that in mind, for the 3 minutes that I have left, I just want to raise three large issues with regards to challenges for political financing, questions that needs to be discussed by agencies such as Transparency International and for institutions such as Bersih and even academics like Terrence. The issue of giving money to the political parties. I think there's something that political parties would definitely welcome, but the manner in which and the mechanism in which this is given also needs to be fine-tuned. So, for example, if you give all the money to the political parties without specifying how they're going to be allocated to individual reps, then you may be giving too much power to the leaders within the political party. But if you give it, let's say, based on the vote share of each party, then what kind of impact will it have on the political system? Right? It may increase the incentives for further fracturing, so that there may be some parties that want to compete just for the sake of getting access to these funds, and that may fracture coalition politics in Malaysia in ways that are very hard to predict. Second issue, donations to political parties as well as individuals, right? So when you want to regulate this, when you want to make people declare, is it declaring their donations to political parties, or is it to individuals, or both? Does it involve companies, or is it individuals? Does it only include individuals? What kind of impact will it have on the willingness of companies and individuals to donate? Because some individuals may not mind donating, but they don't want their names to be disclosed. Some companies, they don't want their names to be disclosed at all, regardless of whether there's a cap or not, right? So, and then if there's a cap or limit, how can this potentially be used or abused by political parties as well as individuals and corporates? This is something that needs to be discussed. And then finally, the issue of spending, by constituency. This is something that, of course, again, self-interest. The amount of money that you spend in a constituency that is very rural and very big, like Hulu Rejang, may be different from an urban area, like let's say Teresa Cox constituency in Sepote. That's also relatively safe. Right? Do you want to limit it by the size, by the number of voters, or even by the residents or population? Right? Because some areas like PJ or Bangi, for example, I have probably about 500,000 residents in my area. Because many of them actually live in Bangi, but they vote elsewhere in Kelantan, in other places around Malaysia. Right? But I have to serve them. When they call me up and say that I need you to help me on X, Y, and Z, I can't say, oh, you're not a voter, I can't help you, right? So these are some of the challenges that MPs face, and I think more dialogues and discussions between, Transparency International and other places with MPs of different constituencies, of different sizes and different level of urbanization would be very useful. My time is up. I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ong. Dr. Ong spoke about how equal constitutional allocation is already happening to a certain degree in Perak and Johor, and how he would like to see it expanded so that it actually encompasses the word equal to all politicians. He talked about how companies limited by guarantees, which are some are controlled by ministries, and how they could potentially be abused. I took particular note of what Dr. Ong said about the MOU and why the political financing was perhaps not in the MOU, but more to the point that he can see political financing being discussed with the government in some way or other. And so maybe this is a point that we could perhaps talk a bit more during the discussion, and how it could be pushed forward and how civil society can play a role there, Dr. Ong. And finally, with regards to political financing per se, Dr. Ong spoke about how mechanisms for how money can be allocated to political parties, donations to political parties, and how spending by constituency. Yeah, so these are all valid points. Thank you, Dr. Ong, for your input. I will now invite Datuk Sri Utama Mukris Tumatir to share his thoughts. Briefly, Datuk Sri Mukris was the Menteri Besar of Kedah on 2 occasions, between May 2013 to February 2016, and again in May 2018 to May 2020. From 2009 to 13, he was a Federal Deputy Minister for MITI. He is also a member of the Kedah State Assembly, having previously held the seat of Air Hitam and currently Jenrun. Datuk Sri is a founding member of both Parti Pribumi Bersatu Malaysia and Parti Pejuang Tanah Air, or Pejuang, serving as the first Deputy President of PPBM and the first President of Pejuang. He was also a former Vice President of Pakatan Harapan and a member of UMNO Youth Executive Council. So Datuk Sri, we'd like to hear your thoughts on this topic.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good morning to everyone. Thank you, first of all, to Transparency International for inviting me to speak on this very important topic. As we all know, it's very clear, especially here in Malaysia, that money seems to lubricate politics. We use the term minyak pelincir. Yeah, it helps move things. It enables political parties to carry out its activities, and it seems like without money, nothing gets moving. So, but of course, the main issue here is that politics must never be seen as a pure commodity, dictated by the highest bidder, politicians becoming representatives of rich donors rather than the constituents that they represent or who voted for them. So the need for financing of elections is clear. I mean, of course, there's a need for that. And I heard what Mr. Thomas mentioned earlier, that he would recommend that parliamentary candidates be allowed to spend up to 400,000 instead of the 200,000 we are allowed right now, and that for state assemblymen to not exceed 200,000 from the 100,000 that we are allowed. This is under, of course, Section 19 of the Election Offences Act 1954. 1954, it was pre-Merdeka. Obviously, this needs to be amended because it's outdated, or perhaps just abolished, because its presence don't really make much sense, and it's very difficult to enforce. So I would think that there should not be any restrictions on how much a candidate could spend, but they have to declare openly about the sources that they have received, how those funds were generated, and how they are used, or for what purpose. The amount declared should also include gifts, services in kind, and things like that. It's not all just cash. I suppose one could say that political donation is a form of freedom of expression, because of people you support, politicians who support those themes, those positions that you support, but there needs to be clearly more transparency, and we've now find that some of these big donations are made with the intention to invest in the politician or the political parties, and this creates rather negative perception about the relationship between the donors and the recipients, particularly if the recipient ends up being government. But I think that if donations were done transparently, perhaps some of these negative perceptions can be negated. So, as I said, no doubt that money flows like water during elections. I know that for a fact. And due to the inefficiency of the current rules and regulations, spending during elections, the situation has created clearly an uneven playing field between candidates, between parties. But I must say that despite the amount of money spent during the GE14 in 2018, still the ruling party lost to PH. This is rather significant as parties with a lot of resources obviously are in better position against poor parties. But and for incumbent parties, I mean, those who are incumbent in government, they might use this to their advantage also in abusing their powers, using government machinery and the like. So another thing is that ruling parties seem to have unlimited access to state-run media during the campaign period. And clearly opposition denied, or even when they are given the opportunity, it's very little compared to what the ruling party gets. But this inequality leads to political parties, especially the opposition, having to move to online platforms using social media. But then again, political parties with huge sums of funding can employ cyber troopers, not only to promote their causes or their parties and their candidates, but also to malign their opposition. And that happens quite a lot. It's not just here. Of course, we can see that in the presidential campaign in the US, fake accounts and such. The other thing that I want to point out is that political funding doesn't happen only during elections. We must understand that it's continuous. Even after the elections end, parties need to continue doing their work. Politicians are moving, so solicitation for funding continues to happen throughout the term. So, but perhaps it peaks during the elections, but it doesn't mean that there's none after elections. It's very clear also from the recent and ongoing court cases that there has been an obscene amount of money. And admittedly, as political donations, we've seen that Datuk Sri Najib admitted that money that he received supposedly from Saudi Arabia, amounting to 2.6 billion ringgit, was to help Barisan Nasional. And he said that rather openly. It raised a few eyebrows, but then didn't seem like there was any action taken after that. We also mentioned just now that the PH government submitted a draft political donation bill to the Parliamentary Bill Review Committee, December 2019, that was mentioned earlier. But unfortunately, not only did the PN government withdraw the bill, but it actually dissolved the Bill Review Committee when they took over government. So I really hope that the Electoral Reform Committee, which was established again during PH's time, which had made some recommendations to regulate political financing, can still continue to do so under this present government. So I'd like to respond to some of the things that Dr. Terence mentioned. One was about MBI and CMI. So it was during Dato' Paul Lau's time, and he visited Kedah. I was first-time MB at the time, and I consulted with him about MBI. And my discussions also with the state legal officer, the legal advisor, I should say, confirmed that MBIs and CMIs are governed by a separate set of enactments. It's not under the Companies Act, and because of that, they seem to have a lot of leeway on business dealings without much transparency, much accountability. So I had suggested during my second time as a MB, we were not only suggesting, I instituted a bill to be discussed in the State Assembly of Kedah for MBI to submit its annual report in the State Assembly, like all other GLCs. Yeah, like say in Kedah, PKNK, Yayasan Islam Negeri Kedah, PKB, and the like. Yeah. So before that, MBIs were not required to submit such a report for the scrutiny of all the adons. So at the same time, I like to say that this present MB is casting all kinds of aspersions about what was going on then, but I'm quite sure that they were all above board, and that's a discussion at another time, perhaps. I also agree with Dr. Ong Kiamin's statement just now about constituency allocation. So during Kedah, when I was still MB, we were looking into, we were the first government to allocate funds to the opposition YBs. I must admit, they were not as much as the government YBs, but then it was a first step. So I hope that more changes like that will occur. So I should end there first because I know I'm running out of my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sri. Thank you very much. Dr. Sri, you spoke about how you used the eloquent term, money flows like water during elections, yes, and how politics must not be seen as a commodity. Interestingly, I just like to point out what you had said earlier, which is your position is that you don't believe there should be any limits on campaign financing. It should be abolished. However, there must be very clear declarations of sources and how the money is spent. So that's something probably interesting that perhaps we could touch on later. And you also expand on the fact that political funding should not only be seen as something that is addressed during campaigning or elections, but it also happens during other times as well. Yes, and your hope that the Electoral Reform Committee can continue to function and look at the recommendations that have taken place. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Sri, again. Our last but definitely not least speaker, YB Isna Raisa Munira Majlis. She is the Warisan MP of Ketua Belud. She served as the Deputy Minister of Energy, Science, Technology, Environment and Climate Change in the PH government until last year. She has been the MP for Ketua Belud since May 2018. YB Munira is one of the younger MPs that we have in Parliament. She has always expressed the hope that there will be a new chapter in Malaysian politics and how she wants to be a part of that change. So she is right now, she is in Parliament, and we welcome YB Munira to share her thoughts on this topic. YB?
Thank you so much for inviting me today. Good morning and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My personal opinion, I do agree with all of the points that have been raised this morning since the beginning of the session today, especially on the independence of EC, Election Commission. The else is the equal access to public media, the needs to regulate political financing. But to me, coming from Sabah, and perhaps I'm the least with experience because I've only encountered with 3 major elections, which is GE13, GE14, and the PRN Sabah recently. I don't think that is just it. I do think that we should look into, to have a free and fair election. I do also think that we need to look into the candidate that buying votes. I think perhaps some people might say you cannot win election in Sabah if you don't have the money, but to be able to see GE14 is a different mode from PRN Sabah. I'm ashamed to say this, but in Sabah during election, you always hear the term of no money, no vote. It's not only receiving political financing, political fund, but also we need to look into how the candidates spend the money. I think if this going on and there is no action towards this, I think we are going to destroy our younger voters to sell their votes to those candidates who actually offered money during PRN Sabah, but I don't want to mention the name. I've seen a candidate. I've seen a candidate who never did any ceramah, who never do any ceramah kelompok. They just went house to house and give money, offered money. Such amount of money. I'm so sorry to say this, and I'm ashamed to say this, but this is what happens in Sabah. It seems like even they really use the situation at that time during PRN, that time when the pandemic started, and I couldn't blame the voters, that they receive money because perhaps that is the only time that will give money. I mean, who will give you money like 200, 300 per person, especially during pandemic where most of us hilang pekerjaan, and I blame the poverty in Sabah that the culture is happening. Although this might be like the smallest act that we can do, it's actually already in the peraturan, but can we emphasize that we should not bring phone to the classroom or the dewan during polling day? That is our biggest enemy. To tell you the truth, in Sabah, in Kota Belud, I can share with you that some of the campaigners, they say, okay, I give you now 200, and then you take picture, you vote for me, you vote for our candidate, and then after you you come to me and show me the proof from your handphone, I will give you another 300 or 100. That is the culture that has been going on during election, and if we focus on the all the points that have been discussed earlier, I think we will not have the free and fair election that we wanted. Because as a candidate, I've been candidate for 2 times. I mean, during GE13 and GE14, we actually always declare the correct amount what we spend, and we always declare the money where did we get the money. But I don't think we solve the problem just by doing so. We need to look into the candidate that buying votes. I think that is the problem that we have in Sabah, especially lah. I think. What else? Yeah, I think that's it for now. I want to say this in this session, coming from Sabah, coming from the rural area in Kota Belud. It's a different trend if you are contesting in Kota Kinabalu or Penampang or perhaps in Putatan. The culture is different in Kota Belud. The more rural the area is, the more I think the money politics play a very important important maksudnya sangat-sangat mempengaruhi. Yeah. I think that's all for now. Thank you.
Okay, terima kasih. Thank you very much, YB Mira. Yes, very valid points that you highlighted, especially in relation to Sabah. You talked about how the candidates allegedly buy votes in Sabah, and how one sometimes uses the pandemic as a cover or as an excuse to give money to voters. But I think more importantly, you also linked it to poverty, yeah, and how generally poverty, wherever it may be, whether it's in Sabah or any other parts of Malaysia, can unfortunately put someone in a position where they need to take that money. Yeah, and then you touch also on the important point of how money politics is especially influential in rural areas. I think that's a very common point. So thank you very much, YB. So now what we will do is time check is 11:30. We'll try, if possible, to finish at 12, because we took a bit of time starting off, and I think everyone had a lot of points that they want to discuss. So if, with everyone's permission, if we can try to go up to 11:50, 55, to have an open discussion, a panel discussion on the points that has been raised today. If I may, if I can just start off with it. And YB, I mean, this was going to be my question to you, but you partly answered it during your presentation, which was the fact that the political financing initiative was not in the MOU that was signed recently between Pakatan Harapan and the government. You did say, however, that there could be ways of it being pushed across for it to be discussed and perhaps move on where it should rightly be. Perhaps you can elaborate a bit on how that can happen, and maybe what role other actors such as civil society can play to help in this place.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Just quickly, I think in any country where sensitive subjects such as political financing, political reform are discussed, usually, from what I've studied, these kinds of advances are done on a quite gradual process. Unless you have some sort of constitutional convention, it's not going to happen in one big sweep. So I think that kind of process probably would be the best for the country moving forward, where you can have incremental process moving, incremental progress moving forward. So my sense is that the constituency allocation part is a good first step forward under this MOU. And then some of the other things that are not in the MOU that perhaps civil society organizations such as Bersih and TI want to bring up is in the area of registering political parties. I think that one is probably more doable in the short term, because probably you can find broader consensus. So, for example, registering political parties under the Election Commission rather than ROS. And I think even UMNO would support this, because you've seen how UMNO have been sort of like victimized over the past year, with their own ROS related decisions. So given the fact that we don't know who's going to be in opposition, who's going to be in government, after the next general election, I think this is something that all parties probably want to push for. Parties like Pejuang and even Muda, because Pejuang was having a lot of problems getting registered. Muda hasn't been registered yet. You have issues of whether Warisan can contest in Peninsular Malaysia or not, because they are still, registered as a Sabah-based party. So I think, trying to tackle the low-hanging fruit would probably be easier compared to wanting to do things like making, companies and individuals declare their political donations to political parties. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone want to add anything to that point?
Perhaps, under the MOU,
yeah.
I think a possibility to explore pursuing political financing is actually through the parliamentary reform, where there's going to be presumably more parliamentary special select committees. So special select committees on political financing reform may be a possibility, or even APPG to pursue that angle. Because I think I disagree with Kian Ming in the sense that I agree in the sense that things should be done incrementally, not suddenly dramatic change. But political financing is an issue that has been talked about for more than a decade, even before Najib, and proposal has been made. And I think this is a opportune time to see some of this being brought to fruition.
Thanks, Thomas. One of the more interesting points that was covered in the Reforming Political Financing book by TI, which was published in 2010, is this is what struck me when I first read the interviews with politicians. Yes, they had a very interesting discussions with politicians of the day. And, page 65 had a candid interview with Yang Berhormat Dr. Mahathir, Dr. Mahathir at that time, Tun Mahathir, with political financing, and he shared a lot of details of this supposedly the war chest held by UMNO then. And if you just quote what was said, so this is quoting Tun at that time. I stepped down, I handed money to Datuk Sri Tun Abdullah Ahmad Badawi, RM 1.4 billion worth of property and cash. The cash alone amounts to more than RM 200 million, end quote, right? And in a follow-up, Tun Badawi's office, this was the reply that was received. Quote, see what was mentioned by Tun Mahathir when I was the president and treasurer of UMNO. When Dr. Abdul Muhammad Azabidi became the treasurer of the party, I handed over everything that Tun Mahathir passed on to me, end quote, the email response. I highlight that just to give an indication in 2010 of the sheer value or the amounts that was being discussed. So, Dato' Sri, if I may, you have been a member of subsequently with Pakatan as PBBM and Pejuang. Have you seen? What efforts have you seen to regulate this kind of issues internally within this party? And do you agree that incumbent governments will always have an advantage in building their internal or war chest, so to speak, when it comes to campaign finance? So how do we address that issue?
Well, first of all, in response to what you just read in the report, we have not had any issues about political parties being involved in companies, in business. Yeah. So if you remember in the so-called heyday of UMNO, they owned the Fleet Group, Renong, KUB. These are the ULCs, the UMNO linked companies. Yeah. So they contributed, I suppose, into the party war chest. Hence the incredible amounts you just mentioned just now. So how are we going to change that, if at all? Are we now going to say that no political parties can no longer be involved in business and things like that? So that's the question to be discussed. I mentioned that I have experience in party elections within UMNO. I was not allowed to participate in the Bersatu party elections, having been expelled just before the election started. But the UMNO one, I think, is where we cut our teeth in elections, and sometimes the intensity of electioning or campaigning is worse in the party elections than compared to even general elections. Why do I say that? because at that time, UMNO and Barisan Nasional were the ruling party. So winning a position within the party sometimes translates to positions as ministers and such. So the competition was really very intense, a lot of money used. So UMNO at the time tried to mitigate this by making the number of delegates who were voting more. At one time, it was just the delegates who came from the divisions to Putra World Trade Center during the PAU, the Perhimpunan Agong UMNO, during the election year, who were being targeted by the candidates. So they were about 3,600 people or so. So you can imagine that it was quite easy to target them. You don't need to talk to all of them. You don't need to buy votes from all of them. You just need maybe half. So the position of president, deputy president, there's only one. The vice presidents, there are three. So and then of course Supreme Council, I think there was 25 or so. So depending on the grades. So to try and tackle money politics, we like to use the term rasuah politik, to make it clear that this kind of activity is considered rasuah. So UMNO changed the way they get the votes from the delegates. So it was now moved to the division level, who voted for Supreme Council positions. So from 3,600, it went up to 46,500 delegates, if I'm not mistaken. That was around that. So you would think that, okay, when you have that many, so perhaps money politics will be reduced. But no, they literally upped the ante and went after the delegates at each division. So the culture of buying votes went down all the way to the division level. So that was really terrible for the party, because then the culture permeated at the grassroots, and it now became quite normal that grassroots members are expected to be compensated for their votes. And to the extent where we have this term SI and SK, SI is salam berisi. So when you salam, there's something in your hands. SK is salam kosong. So me and some of my friends were always known as SKs. So some delegates didn't want to see us. So it's a really work in progress, I suppose. Try and get rid of money politics at the party level.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sri, for sharing that. I'd like to address one of the questions that's been posed by our viewers. Sulip Menon asks the question: is there a clean and efficient model that we should try and emulate? If I can forward this question to Dr. Terence, I know that the book we looked at political financing models in a few countries, and also link it to what Dr. Ong mentioned earlier about the fact that we should be looking possibly at incremental changes, trying to do things on an incremental basis. So, Dr. Terence, is there a way in which we can get these incremental changes into place so that once we don't get the bigger list of recommendations that has been pushed by civil society, at least we get it off the ground and something that is workable but efficient and at least addresses the challenges that we face today. Your thoughts?
Thank you, Alan. First, let me say that generally, when we were doing the study, there was a lot of discussion on the German model. And they like to draw attention to the German model. But when we did the study with G25 leading it, we didn't look at one country. In fact, we looked at best practices from a number of countries. And some of the countries that were really most relevant to us were Korea and Taiwan. Korea and Taiwan are important because they were authoritarian states, which then transitioned to become a democracy. And Taiwan is particularly interesting because they were led by the Kuomintang, the KMT, which was a single dominant party state, which was deeply involved in money politics. Kuomintang had what is known as this black gold phenomenon. And when the transition occurred to democracy, What happened also was how Kuomintang was sent to the doghouse. They had to rehabilitate itself, clean up its act, and de-link itself from this black gold phenomenon, this involvement in business. KMT was deeply involved in business, just like UMNO was deeply involved in business. Now, what this shows is that when you have a transition from authoritarian rule to democracy, you got to move fast. You got to work to get these things done quickly, because you only have a short time gap before the next election comes up. Having said that, this is why I would like to deal with the question or the issue raised by your second point on the low-hanging fruits that Ken Ming referred to. I would have thought that Pakatan would have gone in quickly for the high-hanging fruits, deal with these issues, because these are the issues that have severely corrupted the system. And Mukris mentioned the point that even though a lot of money was spent in 2018, the fact of the matter is the opposition won. The fact of the matter was nobody expected the opposition to win. They won. Now was the time to seize the moment and go in quickly and bring about the changes. Where were the changes? These phenomenal changes that were required to clean up the system quickly. I'll come back to my point. Why wasn't the Political Financing Act instituted quickly? Why wasn't there reform of the shadow world of the GLCs? Mahathir himself referred to the GLCs as a monster. So I'm afraid I have to agree with Thomas. I'm not too convinced by the idea of the low-hanging fruits that will be dealt with by the MOU. The MOU was signed and said to be a historic event in Malaysian politics. This is their words, not mine. A historic event. The coming together of the opposition and the government to deal with a country in crisis. In crisis. And when we are in crisis, are you telling me you're only going to deal with the low-hanging fruits when you come together to deal with this problem? So I would like to encourage the politicians to use the MOU now to go for the high-hanging fruits. If you don't clean up the financing of politics, it's just going to continue to make elections a campaign which is not free and fair. All they have dealt with is they said they're going to have an anti-hopping law. I'm afraid it's not enough, because the hopping is not done just by politicians, it's done by parties themselves. Parties are hopping and creating new coalitions and destabilizing the whole system. So they have to go in tandem, otherwise it's just piecemeal. And if you can have an anti-hopping law done quickly, why can't we have the long-standing Political Financing Act, which has been on the table for a long time, introduced immediately? So that's my feedback, Alan. There are models we can look at. If you read the G25 report, we have detailed reports from each of these countries. I mentioned many countries from Europe, especially the Scandinavian countries, including Germany, and those from Asia, where the context is more similar to what we have in Malaysia, where we are transiting to democracy. We have lost that momentum with the fall of the single dominant party, UMNO. The transition to democracy, we did not have time to consolidate it. Now UMNO is back. And this is my great worry. UMNO is back without any rehabilitation, unlike the case of KMT. So all the more why we are in a real bad state at this moment. And I hope the MOU will be used more effectively. Alan?
Thank you, Dr. Terence. One of the points that was raised in the session yesterday by Dr. Bridget Welsh, she spoke about the patronage in political financing. And she talked about how it disempowers a large proportion of economically disadvantaged communities. And that goes to the Munira, what you were talking about earlier, with regards to communities in Sabah who are in poverty. Vote buying, handouts, etc. Most of the money is being held by the older votes, not distributed to the younger ones. So, as younger MPs in Parliament, YB Munira, how real is this issue of this disenfranchised state of younger voters? That means they don't seem to be part of the process itself. Of course, we see these efforts by Undi 18 to get that push. That's very commendable. But right here now, how can we address the issues of younger voters being disenfranchised or not being part of the overall political process? Because it does seem that the whole process is being controlled by either older politicians or older voters who decide what the voters have to go through. YB Munira?
Hello, everyone. I'm so sorry, but my connection is interrupted just now. So, being the Ketua Wirawati of Warisan, Wirawati is the younger women chief.
Yeah.
We also, conduct the younger women to get more of the involvement and their participation in politics. But I think this is the party should allow more participation. I cannot say this to everyone, but every party should allow the younger ones to get more involvement in politics, and not only their participation, but to let them to have the freedom to express themselves, also to expose them in any of the whatever the like perhaps activities, or should more put them more exposure. Yeah, I'm so sorry. Yeah, the line, the your voice is also very slow. I'm so sorry, sir.
Okay, it's all right, YB. Thank you for your input. Thomas, if I can just get your thoughts on the question of the campaign expenditure that's in place. I mean, I think the fact that again we are using a law that was passed in '54, in terms of limiting 100,000 ringgit and 200,000 ringgit. That seems to be something that is aiming for attention in terms of limits on political funding. Do you think that is something that can be addressed immediately if we take everything else off the table right now, so that we can see that there's some movement towards addressing funding?
Yeah, thank you. I think the spending limit, I'm not sure, but I believe there was probably an adjustment on the limits over the years. So, I mean, if we are talking about 200,000 in 1954, that's a huge fortune, and it's quite unlikely that will be the limit then. But whatever it is, I think it has to be adjusted for inflation. But on this point, YB Mukris said that he believed it is better that there's no limit, but there should be greater transparency and accountability. But I know we had this discussion, and I think Bruce went through kind of nationwide consultation with political parties and other stakeholders on amending the Election Offences Act, and this issue came up. So there were also parties that say that there should be no limit, or raise the limit to 500,000 or 1 million. But at the end of the day, it came down to, for us, our recommendation is just to double it. The reason is because we want the playing field to be level for all parties, all candidates. Because when you have no limit or raise the ceiling very high, you're going to have only very rich people, very rich candidates competing. And you're going to have a situation like American politics, where fundraising will be a major issue, and there is no limit. You're talking about, several $100 million. And we don't want that situation. It's about level playing field. So that's why 400,000 we feel is reasonable. And I think you can talk to many candidates, who have won, which even far less than that. They did not reach the limit. So why they are able to win is because I think they bothered to really go to the ground and build relationship and use volunteers to win. I think this is the kind of spirit we want to go back to, away from money politics. So that's why I think I would defend that. Then the other point that YB Mukris brought up is ERC. I know ERC well because I was part of it together with some of my colleagues, part of the committee. It was a 2-year mandate, the ERC. After the 2 year, which ended in August 2020, it was dissolved But the final report recommendation, which included political financing, the same bill that was started under Najib, found its way into that, and it was made as one of the recommendations. So certainly it is there. I think on Ken Ming's point about public funding concerns also is that the centralization of the fund to political party leaders, so that they don't need to then, if they got public funding, they don't need to look to the membership or the ground anymore. Concentration of power and funds in their hand. But I think this is where any public funding you can fine tune to ensure that the money must go for certain purposes, research, operation, and also even to state level, so that it doesn't concentrate in the hand of the treasurer of the party alone to decide what he wants to do. I think the other concern is vote share funding. That if you have public funding, you're going to kind of promote more fragmentation, and some party that perhaps don't deserve, should not be funded, are getting funding. But I think without funding, the smaller parties who has legitimate support, they stand no chance at all. I think of, like Muda and even Pejuang. If you don't have public funding, how to compete with some of the bigger established party to survive? So I think it really does want to attempt to level the playing field. But the mechanism, that's where it can be some tweaking involved.
Okay, great. Thank you, Thomas. Thomas, I'll also take your responses as you're wrapping up comments, because we are approaching 12 o'clock. So I just want to give all the other panelists perhaps a minute or minute and a half to sum up whatever thoughts that you had to share with us before we close today's session. So if I can start with YB Munira, if you can hear me, if you could just give us your thoughts in a minute and a half on your closing remarks, YB.
Oh yeah, thank you. To me, no matter how we try to, I thank you for the 22 points on all the relevant points just now. I agree to it, but I also want this session to look into the ones that I pointed out, that the connection, the candidate tries by votes, because if we don't have solution for it, I don't think that this discussion can solve the free and fair election we wanted to see. Perhaps because that is the thing that happens in my constituency, and also I think Sabah, and I agree with Mr. Alan just now, not only in Sabah, but a lot of the constituency where most of the people are in poverty. I think we should look into this, and the EC also should look into during the election, what's happening on the ground, and we want to have a free and fair election. Whatever result is, we should accept if free and fair election is adalah.
Okay. All right. Terima kasih, YB Munira. Thank you very much for your input. Dato' Sri, your thoughts, please.
Yes, as a political party, Pejuang is absolutely okay with any new improved regulations to regulate elections. What we ask for is for it to be consistent, to be fair, to be applied across the board. Everyone has the same to follow, that no advantage be given to anyone, especially the incumbents, and to the richer candidates or parties. So that, in a nutshell, is what we're for, and we will support any bill that addresses that in Parliament.
Thank you, Dr. Sri. Dr. Ong?
Yeah, just like to thank TI, Terence, Bersih, all the stuff that you're doing. We may not necessarily see eye to everything, but I think the general direction is one that we can agree on. So keep on pushing us. I sometimes get annoyed with Terence, but I think he proposes these things from a good place. But I also hope he and others can also understand the struggles that I face on a daily basis on many other issues, not just this. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Ong. Dr. Terence, the final from you.
Thank you. First, I want to comment quickly on the volume of money used during elections, 100,000, 200,000. It's completely outdated. In our recommendations, we said what we should look is the size of the constituency. So, for example, if you have a constituency of 100,000, you should get more money for your expenditure, as opposed to a constituency which has only 10,000 people. Those kinds of issues. And what if you're a rural community? If you go to Sarawak to go and campaign, you need a helicopter to go and do your campaigning. So those issues also will push up your campaign expenses. So this thing, putting a lump sum figure there and saying that will be solve the problem is not the way. We have to be more innovative. So what does this show? One, the laws are completely out. Second, the institutions are weak. We need major institutional reform. EC must be reformed quickly to be made truly independent. So those two, I hope we can get out of the politicians to put the legislative and institutional reforms in place quickly. The second one, I spoke about the shadow world. I spoke about the GLCs. I also spoke about the foundations. There is a shadow world. This is where the money is coming from. Dark money. We got to put a stop to this. To be greater disclosure on the part. I would like to thank Ken for pointing out, yes, Hannah Yeo came to launch the report that we had at C4 on politics. And I told Hannah at that point, you're the only politician, the brave young politician coming to speak, because we couldn't get others to speak. So thank you for pointing that out. But the point is, Ken also noted, only one politician spoke up. One young politician spoke up. Where are the other ones? I speak here to the leaders of the parties to take the lead in bringing disclosure to the sources of political financing. And the final point, which I want to address, is this: the Political Financing Act must be in tandem with other legislation, and the hopping law goes in tandem with the Political Financing Act. So I hope these things will be done collectively. I hope the Select Parliamentary Committee will be set up to look at these issues that we just spoke about. And a final word to Ken Ming. Ken Ming, I always like engaging with you. I'm always provocative, but I have admiration for the work that you and your colleagues have been doing to bring about the changes in government. And I want to close with this point. For the politicians like Ken and Hannah, who have been really speaking up on this, I hope they will continue to do the kind of work that they're doing. Know how difficult it is, the conditions under which they are working. And that's why if they need help, we will always be there to help you with the work that you're doing to bring these reforms. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. I'd like to also thank all our audience who had posted questions. Sorry, we couldn't go through all of them. Very much for the pertinent questions that you posed. Join me in thanking our panelists, Thomas Fan, Dr. Franz Gomez, YB Ong Kian Ming, YB Sri Utama Mukris, and YB Isnaraisa Majlis for your value and points that was highlighted during the session today. If you just allow me a minute to summarize, I will go back to 2 points which were discussed at various points during today's session. Firstly is the cost of elections in Malaysia. The quotes that I gave from the book, that was in 2010. So just if you imagine the multiplication factor, inflation, etc., the cost of campaigning in Malaysia today, how much is it today, and why it is so important that it's addressed immediately. Addressing political financing, TI has always felt will go a long way towards removing the element of corruption from the political process. Yeah. So it is actually not the low-hanging fruit, but the biggest fruit that is to be addressed. Yeah. How we go about doing it and whether we address everything within that concept is a matter for further discussion. But it is our hope that the other point that I wanted to make was that a draft legislation exists. We are not starting from ground zero. discussions, awareness, input from all stakeholders, political parties included, have been garnered over the years, right? So whilst we are not there yet, we do have something to work on, and it's a question of how we push that something to the next level, which is ideally getting it into the Parliamentary Select Committee for discussion on new bills, right? And that is where our three MPs who have joined us today and the other MPs in Parliament can play their role in pushing this agenda across. CSOs will continue to push for this. It's important that MPs and political parties realize the importance of reforming political finance in Malaysia. My last message is that this was the #1 priority in the original NACP, National Anti-Corruption Plan. And kudos to the Pakatan Harapan government at that time for placing it as the #1 priority. Unfortunately, it is not. The timeline has been pushed back 2 years. What we need to do is get it back to its rightful position as the #1 priority, and hopefully see it being discussed in the PSC in Parliament in the not too distant future. So with that, again, I'd like to thank our 5 panelists for their input. I'd like to thank our audience for participating in their questions. And I would like to thank TI for organizing this very important discussion. Thank you very much, everyone. Good evening and have a wonderful day. Goodbye.
Thank you.